Good morning, guys. Today we're going to start looking at fiscal policy, okay? And you can take a second to read through this title. Um, Pretty straightforward. So this is a fairly interactive lecture. It's going to require you to kind of stop, start, hit a video, answer some questions, that sort of thing, okay? So here we go. Your EQ, examine the impact of fiscal policy in achieving potential GDP. Now, the goal here, obviously, is a potential GDP, and that's the growth that we measure, right? So there's two ways to look at it. We're going to first start with the demand side fiscal policy. We'll look at monetary policy and supply side policy next week, okay? So we're going to just do fiscal policy on the demand side of things first. Just to remind you what a business cycle looks like, and the point here, that blue line is what you want. You want potential. You always want that potential GDP rising. There is always a peak in expansion. You don't want to always have peaks. You don't want to just keep growing and growing and growing at astronomical levels, because usually that has a negative consequence, which I will get into. So what does fiscal policy actually mean, or what is the word fiscal? Well, it's basically money, right? You have to, if you're in the government, spend money. And how do you do that, right? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We hear a lot about the fiscal cliff. Congress is knocking old Uncle Sam off the fiscal cliff. And basically what that says is Congress is spending entirely too much money. We hear this constantly in the media about the debt and the deficit and so on and so forth. And there's a video in this lecture, it's about 3 minutes long, that'll kind of run through a bit of that in a moment. First, I'm going to ask you to take a minute. You're going to pause this video and you're going to read through this section and you're going to answer these 4 questions, okay? These are for your notes. What are the 3 sources of revenue in a government budget? What are the 3 types of government expenditure in a government? What is the difference between a budget surplus and a budget deficit? And what is the difference between a budget deficit and a government debt, okay? Do we know the answers to these? You should, okay? I don't really want to take the time to run through every single one of these. What I do want to say is that if you've read this carefully, we would have run through this together as a class, and you would have found that it's a pretty simple, okay? Now is the video. You could take a minute to watch. Well, it's more than a minute, it's about 3 minutes. You're going to want to go into the actual slideshow and click on the lecture so you can run through it, and then you're going to click on this video and watch it. So you've just finished watching the video, and now I'm going to talk to you quickly about budget surplus and deficits. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that we often spend in deficit. There's probably only 10, 11 years where we've been in a net positive. And those are usually around booms, right? So the post-World War II boom in our economy is there. And then you also see the dot-com bubble when we were in the positives. Like I said, at the beginning of the year, this is not a politics or a government class, right? We're not going to sit here and talk about who's responsible for what. But when you look at those positive budget surpluses, it doesn't matter who's in power. There is always a politician to take credit for whatever the policy is that caused this, right? You'll also notice that with some of the spending, especially the larger amounts, there's usually a big event in the world going on, causing a larger expenditure or a larger deficit, right? 2009, for example, 2010. And please note that as the recovery of our economy continued after that Great Recession of 2009, you see that mysteriously the deficit is lower, right? So as the economy recovers, right? And if you see 2001, you could see that we had a shock with September 11th, and it took us a while to get out of that, right? So things happen. That's just the ebb and flow of a budget and a deficit, right? A surplus or a deficit. It should be said, the government has to chooses how to spend its money, and it's delegated in mandatory and discretionary spending. And mandatory is exactly how it sounds. You've got, 100. So let's say you're looking at a pie chart about 100%, right? It's broken up in a couple of categories. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid take up the most of that mandatory spending. So that's the money that they have to spend, right? And you constantly hear fiscal hawks talk about how we have to cut that mandatory spending down. And then there's discretionary spending, and that's what the government chooses to actively spend its money on. Military spending is at about 52% for 2009, and then or 19 rather, and every other expenditure that the government has is under 10% in discretionary spending. So you spend 52% on military, and then it's 7% to run the government itself, 7% for transportation, 7% for education, 5% for housing assistance, 5% for health. And when you hear people talk about the amount of money that is spent, you have to decide for yourself what you think is the right amount of money to spend. And that's when you come up with a budget, how difficult it can be. When we say 7%, for example, that's still an awful lot of money, right? So you have to consider these things when we're looking at surplus, deficit, how money is allocated. Federal debt total, you can take a look, and this is just another graph for you to kind of take care of or look at. And then, as you noted with that video, United States debt as a percentage of GDP, you can kind of get a feel for the different presidents and compare it to other countries. It's interesting to kind of look at the debt as a whole. So I'm going to get into this part on the next video.